From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's like Christmas Eve at the White House. We still don't know what's under the tree. Welcome to the fastest show in politics. On this day before President Trump makes it official, announcing tariffs on most imports to the U.S. Liberation Day, as he calls it. The Rose Garden is being dolled up as we speak, and we'll be joined ahead by Bloomberg's Laura Davison with more on what to expect. This as Congress prepares for some critical votes this week. Coming days will set the stage for reconciliation. We'll get into that and a lot more with Nathan Dean at Bloomberg Intelligence. And as the administration deports another plane load of detainees, migrants to El Salvador, we're going to talk about the politics behind the deportations, which could be challenging the narrative at the White House. Our signature panel weighs in with Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. On this day before the tariffs take effect, we start, as always, on Wall Street. Charlie Pellet has that for us with his view on the markets. Charlie?
And good day from New York, Joe Mathieu. Just over 24 hours to go until that formal tariff announcement. Never too early to start beating the promo drum, because we got you covered live on Bloomberg Television and Radio, 4 p.m. when it all comes down. And indeed, we got special coverage tonight on Balance of Power. Ahead of that, with a special tariff program tonight here on Bloomberg Radio. S&P right now advancing. Earlier losses have declined. Right now we are looking at a 30-point gain, up 0.5%, 56.41. We've got the Dow up 101, up 0.2%. NASDAQ right now up by 1%, and the 10-year 4.15%, with the 2-year right now 3.86%. Spot gold moving lower, down 0.5%, 31.09 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude retreating today, down 0.1%, 71.38 a barrel. And Bitcoin now surging 3.4%, 85,244. We are seeing a rally in the world's largest tech companies. That is helping lift stocks. Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond President Tom Barkin says President Trump's tariffs could raise both inflation and unemployment, creating a big challenge for the central bank. Tomorrow, that big Rose Garden event. Again, we'll have it for you live at 4 p.m. Tiffany Wilding is an economist at PIMCO.
You have to believe this is the beginning of a negotiation. You know, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty around that and how ultimately that plays out. But I think we really just don't have a good sense, because we haven't seen this type of shock, in quite some time. Obviously, global markets are much different now than they were in the 1930s.
A reference to the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that many will tell you wound up worsening the Great Depression. Auto stocks trading mix right now. We got GM higher ahead of tariff announcements, up 1.2%. Ford down 0.5. Stellantis lower by 0.6%. Tesla today, all part of a broader tech rally, surging by 6.5%. Balance of Power continues. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host is Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie, great to see you. Charlie Pellet on the Tuesday edition. Yeah, it's only Tuesday. Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite radio channel 121, and YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. We'll meet you there. Keep the live stream up and running, the next 3 days? We've got special programming in place. Today, tomorrow is Liberation Day, as Donald Trump calls it. Cue the countdown clocks. It's the day before. And we don't know a lot more today than we did yesterday. If you ask anyone watching the markets like Charlie Pellet, he'll tell you that. Although we seem to be feeling good for the heck of it, it is pretty nice out after all. It's going to be nice out tomorrow on the Rose Garden as well. And on the car dealer lots. This has been an interesting part of the story. You buy a car in the last couple of days, good luck finding one depending on where you are. As we now hear more about the front loading on the consumer side, GM, Hyundai, both reporting big jumps in auto sales. Ahead of this, GM deliveries up 17% first quarter, 15% gain in retail volume. Ford retail sales up. Toyota, slight growth in the first 3 months of the year because, well, God knows anything could happen. And Donald Trump reminded us of that when he appeared alongside Kid Rock in full rock regalia behind the desk in the Oval Office last night. Listen.
They're reciprocal. So whatever they charge us, we charge them, but we're being nicer than they were. The numbers will be lower than what they've been charging us, and in some cases maybe substantially lower, but we sort of have a world obligation perhaps. but we're going to be very nice. Relatively speaking, we're going to be very kind. I think they have a chance of doing better, actually, with the tariffs. It can actually help them in a certain way. And I think a lot of them will drop their tariffs.
Wait a minute. We're going to be very kind. You heard that, right? In some cases, tariffs may be substantially lower. Maybe we're in for something different here. This is curious. Laura Davison covers this all day and helps to steer our coverage in Washington as editor of Bloomberg's politics team. Great to see you. Welcome back. We have no idea what's going to happen here tomorrow. It feels like than we did yesterday. What do we know, however? There's a Rose Garden event, and it's going to start after the closing bell.
It'll start at 4 o'clock. That's the stated time. He'll come out to the Rose Garden and speak for, Trump typically speaks for 45 minutes to an hour when he comes out. He'll likely take some questions, but we don't know exactly what this will look like, how these things have played out in the past. As Trump has come out, he's sort of made some big sweeping pronouncements. He's maybe gotten a little bit into the specifics, but then there's some sort of call for reporters to go and hear more about what the details are. And the thing, particularly on this one, because there could be a different rate for every country or different rates for different groups of countries. Right. People are waiting to see what is the actual paper, the plan. Something will need to hit the Federal Register to make this important. And if you don't know what the Federal Register is, consider yourself lucky. But this is basically the big book of all of the federal regulations that are coming out any single day. So all eyes are going to be on that, and that will potentially, move markets overseas and futures markets as, everyone is digesting this in real time.
So this will be interesting then. We could be in a world where we've got a news conference happening with Donald Trump. We're writing and reporting off of his words before we actually get a chance to read the executive order. Is that right? That's
very right. And that's probably why we've seen a little bit of this, of the time shift here of, this is going to likely be happening after markets close to potentially prevent some of these big wild swings that could be happening.
In case Trump he's misinterpreted somehow.
Misinterpreted, or, Trump is known to be, bombastic and not super precise in his language. So he could say something that ends up being not exactly what's in the actual text of the order.
What do we think we know? And by the way, you claw me back when you need to here. Reciprocal tariffs, he keeps saying that. We're going to get some form of reciprocity tomorrow. Auto tariffs, he's talked about, right? 25%. We expect that tomorrow?
We expect that tomorrow. Okay. It goes into effect. They start collecting essentially on April 3rd.
Understood. So we'll have maybe a box to check there. He's talked about a lot of other tariffs, though, as well. When it comes to different sectors, chips, for instance, is that still something that they're crafting, or will we hear about that tomorrow?
Right now, we don't believe that that's what's coming. He has indicated several times that those sectoral tariffs on pharma, on semiconductors, on copper, those are things that will be coming later. He's reiterated that he's committed to those, but that's not a this week, at least right now, not a this week plan.
What's already in effect? We need to remind ourselves and our listeners of this, too. We've got China and a couple layers of China tariffs already in place.
We've got 20% on China. There was a 10% and then a second 10%. We have the 25% on Mexico and Canada with an exemption that's been in place for UMCA-compliant goods.
Which is a lot of stuff.
And that's also set to expire this week as well. So that's another
Will that be updated
pillar.
Tomorrow, then?
Potentially. We don't know.
Wow.
So there's a lot of moving pieces.
Steel and aluminum?
Steel and aluminum, that's been into effect, 25% on that.
That's already there.
And the thinking in the White House right now is that these are all going to be stacked tariffs. So if you're China and there's a 20% tariff on you already, you could be seeing yet another 20%. Or if you're South Korea, you export a lot of cars to the U.S. and that 25% auto tariff is going to hit you, you could again be seeing another percentage added on top of that. So these could be some really big swings that we're seeing.
Donald Trump has talked about as well secondary tariffs, not secondary sanctions, but tariffs on Venezuelan oil and Russian oil. But those were kind of veiled threats in Truth Social posts. Does that become part of the story tomorrow?
It's, again, another unknown, but something to watch. That he's been very, become very fond of this phrase "secondary tariffs" as a way to sort of, punish behavior. Countries that are using Venezuelan oil. All of this is to say that nobody knows what's happening. Even at the White House, they're still debating. We could even see, Trump alluded to it in his comments earlier on Monday, that he wants to be, quote, nice. Originally, they had sort of envisioned this big plan that they would take all the tariffs that, an average rate of all the tariffs that a certain country has, look at other things like value-added taxes and digital service taxes and other trade barriers, and come up with some calculation and say, okay, for every country, here's a different number. That was going to be exceptional exceptionally difficult to do, and they're sort of at the point where they're realizing they don't really have time. So we may see a much more dialed back plan of saying, okay, certain countries are, there's just either a 10% across the board, which is what he talked about on the campaign trail, or we could see countries grouped into different, sort of what Trump views as the worst offenders to some of the countries he wants to be more friendly to. So they have a lower percentage. If you're a country that he's been more adversarial to, you get a higher number.
Well, that's really important. That's news, because we're trying to figure out what this means, right? As he just said, in some cases may be substantially lower. Is that what he's referring to? Or could that also involve maybe phone calls that are coming in from world leaders in the next 24 hours?
It could also be about those phone calls that are coming in. But Bloomberg Economics has done a ton of great work sort of parsing out sort of what these numbers could be sort of on a maximalist approach and a minimalist approach. Trump and his team are looking at those sorts of numbers and saying, okay, if we were to include all of these, we could be at 50, 60, 70%. I think they realize that there's a huge market reaction, and having numbers like in the 10 to 25% range, which is kind of where Trump has been, those are a little bit more palatable and give you a little bit more negotiating room.
Fascinating. We've heard some other possible caveats, at least suggested caveats, for instance, from automakers, low-cost auto parts. Is that something the White House is entertaining, or just part of the noise going into this?
He's certainly still taking some meetings that we reported on, and there are calls coming in, as the car dealers are reporting that, their cars are flying off the shelves, because it's not, they're able to accept, okay, if we have these import taxes on cars, we can work with that. But when it's all the low cost parts that go into all the cars that are made here, suddenly that becomes, one auto executive described it as sort of just like an industry killer.
Interesting.
And they see that as kind of the biggest pain point and sort of the most acute crisis right now.
Wow. You heard anything about the optics tomorrow? I mean, he's got Kid Rock. Did you see that outfit Kid Rock was wearing, by the way? How do I get one of those? I don't really mean that, but Donald Trump knows how to seize the show business. How does he do that tomorrow? Something he's billing as Liberation Day. Is Kid Rock going to have the band set up in the Rose Garden? What are we? Is there fireworks involved?
There will almost certainly be some amazing visual element. This is the first Rose Garden event he's done of the second term. That's almost no surprise that he is sort of saving this big grand space, which, by the way, he's remarked that he wants to pave over and have as a patio a la Mar-a-Lago. So this may be the last Rose Garden event. We'll see. But
could we show up tomorrow and it's paved like they did that overnight?
Unlikely.
This is
unlikely. But it's going to be
consider.
something. We're going to see cabinet secretaries there. This is going to be, if you are who's who in Trump world, you're going to be at this event tomorrow.
If they pave the Rose Garden, we can get the charcoal grill out there and really party a little bit. You're going to be there for this, or you're going to be here with us?
I'll be behind my terminal.
All right, fantastic. Exactly where we want Laura Davison to be. Great to have you back. Don't be a stranger, of course. Bloomberg Politics editor Laura Davison with us on the fastest show in politics as we wind up the band here the day before Liberation Day. Nathan Dean is on the way in, our senior U.S. policy analyst from Bloomberg Intelligence. His take on what happens next in reconciliation on Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Just getting word that U.S. government agencies, including the Defense and Energy Departments, have frozen several dozen research grants at Princeton University. Princeton's president says the school will cooperate with the government in combating anti-Semitism while also defending academic freedom and due process rights. Stocks higher across the board. We are seeing a rally in the world's largest tech companies as investors brush off weak economic readings to focus on prospects for interest rate cuts. Right now, we got the S&P up 33, 56.45, gain there of 0.6%. The Dow up 111, up 0.3%, and ahead of the big tariff announcement tomorrow, NASDAQ is advancing 175 points, now up by 1%. And to be sure, we are seeing a rally in tech names. We've got the NASDAQ 100 index up now by about 0.8%. 10-year 4.16%, the 2-year 3.86% on the 2-year. Gold retreating from a record down 0.5%, 31.06 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.1%, 71.38 a barrel. Conservative media outlet Newsmax is having a meme stock moment today. Shares surging again. Right now we are looking at an advance for Newsmax of 71.2%, building on that 735% surge yesterday in its debut session. And President Trump has signed an executive order aimed at cracking down on ticket scalping and fees that drive up the cost of attending live events for consumers. Live Nation is the world's largest ticket seller. It is the parent of Ticketmaster. Live Nation shares right now, they are trading little change, actually up by 1.2%. Again, recapping, stocks higher ahead of tariffs. S&P advancing now by 31 points, up 0.6%. Back we go to Washington. Once again, your host of Balance of Power, here he is, Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie Pellet with the Kid Rock bump on Wall Street. It's great to see you, Charlie. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, satellite radio, channel 121, and on YouTube. Yeah, this day before the tariffs go into effect, it's pretty much all anyone's talking about in Washington and, for that matter, on Wall Street. It's all we've been talking about for days. We'll sit here tomorrow, right at this time, wondering exactly what President Trump is going to announce. It'll be in the Rose Garden at 4 o'clock. If it's what we're hearing, and by the way, we're hearing a lot of different things from the president himself, from his lieutenants like Scott Bessent and Howard Lutnick. But Mark Zandi says this is going to hurt. You talk about no pain, no gain. Assuming the permanent tariffs take effect in the current quarter, if Donald Trump showed up with full smash tomorrow, Liberation Day, 20% across the board, right? He's threatened it. Mark Zandi says the economy would almost immediately tumble into a recession that would last for more than a year, sending the jobless rate above 7%. Chief economist Moody's Analytics, that's his worst case scenario. Say what you will. You can try to blow holes in that. Maybe you should. Maybe this leads to a new world order. But could be a little bit difficult to navigate in the outset here. And certainly when the president speaks at 4 o'clock in the Rose Garden, could be a little bit difficult to actually get our arms around everything that's being announced here, unless it is just an across-the-board 20%. We're talking about dozens, if not hundreds of countries. So every day I get up out of my little desk in front of my terminal in the newsroom and I walk around the other side of the room and I see Bloomberg Intelligence. They got their row lined up. These are the sharpest men and women in the room, right? You know Nathan Dean, and he's sitting there with his headset on taking phone calls from people just like you wondering what in the world is going to happen next. The fun part about Nathan is they can ask him about anything. It's not just tariffs. It's about the reconciliation deal, the budgeting process, the debt ceiling on Capitol Hill, and so forth. That's why he is the senior U.S. policy analyst at BI. Nathan Dean, welcome back. Who's calling today?
We actually had a couple calls this morning, obviously, about tariffs. But, you know, the interesting thing is that a lot of the investors that were calling us are looking forward to tomorrow just in the form that you're going to get data and you're going to get intelligence and you potentially get some clarity. Now, I don't think it's going to be the clarity that everybody's going to say, look and see, but it's like the clarity you get when you go to the dentist and like, you know, afterwards, you feel a little bit better just because you got it over with.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, but I think what's going to happen tomorrow is you're going to see the statement of here are these tariffs. Some of them are going to go in April 3rd, but I also think you're going to see some uncertainty in terms of, okay, now that these tariffs are here, what's the negotiation ploy? How do we walk this back? Because there's this general feeling in Wall Street that President Trump's not going to do this. Well, then he does. Okay, well, if he does it, is he going to walk it back? And just remember, you know, we're beginning to see some angst on the Senate Republican side. Tonight's vote potentially could be that. We saw President Trump just, you know, put on Truth Social a few moments ago saying, hey, you know, maybe potentially Senator Collins, don't vote with the Democrats tonight. So, you know, I think you're going to get some clarity tomorrow, but not enough that you're going to feel really good going into next week, because this party is going to continue just for the next few weeks and months.
You're talking about this effort by Democrats to a legislative answer to this that Tim Kaine, the Democrat from Virginia, is pursuing. This isn't going anywhere, is it?
No, I mean, obviously, House Speaker Mike Johnson has already prohibited the ability for the House to pick up something. And then secondly, I would just say this is a resolution. I mean, this isn't really so much a piece of legislation. And, you know, Congress delegated its authority many, many years ago to the president in terms of implementing tariffs, whether it's Section 301 or IEPA or so forth. And Congress isn't going to take that back. I mean, because if you get congressionally mandated tariff, then you need a congressional mandate to undo the tariff. And presidents over the last 50 years, Congress has always felt that presidents need that flexibility.
See Kid Rock in the Oval last night?
That was a great dress. Or, sorry, a great outfit.
Yeah, my God. The colors were, you know, I mean, I don't know who his tailor is, but shades of Elvis with Nixon. What were they trying to go for there? Do you think these guys really get along?
Oh, I think so, but I also think that President Trump needs the Rust Belt to support him through this, because the question we get from investors a lot of time is, what will it take for President Trump to pull back on these tariffs? And we've always come back with our own view is consumer confidence within the Rust Belt, because all the actions that we've seen so far on tariffs, these aren't things that, mom and pop go to grocery stores and purchase. I mean, we've talked about it on a philosophical and a theoretical exercise. When we talk about automobiles, for example, or if you talk about reciprocal tariffs on potash from Saskatchewan, farmers are going to start getting involved. The Rust Belt's going to start getting involved. And President Trump is going to need those supporters to keep the line, because I think President Trump, in his view, sees this as a long-term effort, even though there's going to be a lot of short-term gain.
It makes you wonder if Kid Rock is more the conscience of the White House than, say, Elon Musk is. But I bring up that event yesterday because of what President Trump said. Could be significantly or substantially lower, I think the word was that he used, substantially. He said we're going to be kind relative to our trading partners. So is there some massive relief rally on Thursday when these tariffs don't have near the teeth that many thought?
I don't think so, because President Trump often changes his mind. First there's going to be the shock, then there is the awe, then there is the walk back. And, we even saw it over the weekend when President Trump on Air Force One said that, I'm going back to this idea of reciprocal tariffs, broad reciprocal tariffs. That's something that Washington really hadn't been thinking about, because everybody presumed there was going to be sectoral tariffs. And as long as President Trump is still thinking about tariffs, I don't think you're going to get much clarity in terms of a long-term, or say for the next few quarters. But I will say, though, is that I think, as you move away from the tariffs into more of the Senate budget resolution or the extending of the tax cuts, there are going to be elements of that markets are going to like. Yeah. And, getting two of them together, you may be able to get to a situation where you can work it out and figure out this is what the status quo will be for the next few months. Apparently,
the vote with Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia may be delayed because of what's happening on the Senate floor right now. Have you been watching Senator Booker? Cory Booker has been talking. This is a live view, right? There are a couple of senators, I guess, that are getting involved here. I don't know if you can tell us what's happening, James, but Booker's been talking for over 12 hours. I think it's over 15 or something like that. They're fooling around with the feed here. But if that goes on, the vote might not take place. Your point is it doesn't matter anyway. What is it that Wall Street is most scared of learning tomorrow?
Well, I think it's what you just alluded to earlier in terms of a broad, large tariff that potentially puts us into a recession. Because if you think about this in terms of 2025, I think a lot of Wall Street analysts and investors were anticipating getting an adrenaline shot in the arm from the tax cuts or the tax extensions. But subsequently, the tariff is potentially something that's just working to the opposite of that. And then you throw into all this idea of the deficit not being reduced and so forth. Where I'm going with here is that the one thing I think the markets really want to see tomorrow is a definitive statement. Either it's here's what the tariffs and here's what you have to deal with for the next few months, or I've decided to pull back and we're going to pause for 30 to 60 days. I think the one thing the markets will not like is if you get a situation where some tariffs go into fruition on April 3rd, some tariffs get pushed off, and President Trump essentially says to the world, we're now open for negotiation, and we go back and forth to this game of, is it sectoral, is it reciprocal, or is it not happening at all?
Do we get a vote this week on a budget resolution that might start to answer some questions on reconciliation? That's the other major story that's churning in Washington. I'm guessing your phone's ringing a fraction of the time on this, but this is important to the markets too.
Yeah, I think we do, because what we're telling our clients is just remember, this is not a legislation bill. There's no specific language in here. It's a blueprint, and it's easy to vote for a blueprint. I mean, you're not putting it. It's like, look, I could vote for a blueprint to lose weight, but trying to figure out how to stop eating those cookies, that's a little bit more difficult thing, and that's where the Senate is at the moment. All they're trying to do is vote for a blueprint. They're going to fight another day. Now, obviously, the House and the Senate have to figure out their differences. We saw a lot of folks on the House side saying, look, I don't like this idea that the Senate is only pursuing a $3 billion floor. And obviously, there's not going to be, if you include things like the debt ceiling, there's a lot of differences here between the House and the Senate. But we remain committed, at least with our call, that 80% chance by the end of the year, Congress figures out a deal to keep that tax extension going. Whether it's for a couple of years or where it's longer, it's still to be determined. But we do not see taxes going up at the end of this year. We do think they'll come to an agreement.
Does the debt ceiling end up being included here, or does that have to be handled alone because this will take much longer than anyone's anticipating?
You know, what we tell our clients is it doesn't matter to us. Yeah. We think the debt ceiling is going to get raised either way. But it does matter in terms of the timing of this. We've always said that we think the tax extension bill is going to come after the August recess. Okay. But if Treasury and the Congressional Budget Office comes back and says the debt ceiling is in August and it's included, obviously that's going to push the calendar up. So if they pursue with the debt ceiling, I think President Trump can get those skeptical House Republicans on board with the debt ceiling vote. Obviously, they're not going to like it. If it's $5 trillion in extension, you know, they're obviously not going to like that. But as we saw with the continuing resolution, President Trump, if he gets into the nitty-gritty of congressional debates, he could probably get those House skeptical Republicans on board.
This is going to end up being a much louder story in Washington, right? Standalone debt ceiling. Maybe they attach something to it, but they're going to have to get to this first.
Yeah, obviously. And look, it has to get done, or else you're going to have extreme market issues, especially in the fixed income side.
Yeah. All right. So there's Cory Booker. We found him for you. He started at 7 o'clock last night. I was way off. He's been going for like 17 hours. And I don't know if he ends up in the history books here, but he's been speaking in protest, of course, it's not just the tariffs, Donald Trump's policies up and down across the board. What do you think of this? It's like Jimmy Stewart time for Cory Booker.
You know, I'm going to let you in on some technical analysis about right before we came on the call.
Please.
We were all looking at how amazing he looked for being up for as long as he had.
Yeah. What are they giving him?
I would be in an absolute. But, you know, obviously, I think that Senator Booker's doing this for political reasons. He's doing this in a way to showcase to people that, look, he knows how to fight. And I think this is just something that you're going to see more and more of over the next couple of years.
Fascinating. As we watch, he's not done. I mean, we could hit 20 hours, 24 hours. What's for dinner in New Jersey? Nathan Dean, the best. Thank you, sir, as always, at Bloomberg Intelligence with our live view of the Senate floor here on YouTube. Search Bloomberg Business News Live. Meet us here for our live stream. Senator Booker just getting started, it looks like. We'll assemble our panel next. Rick and Jeannie are on the way in right here on Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We are off session highs, but still holding on to a 7-point gain right now on the S&P 500 index. The Dow has turned negative since our last update. Right now, we've got the Dow down 70, drop there of 0.2%. S&P keeping it all in context, up by about 0.1%. NASDAQ, the composite index, up 93. That is a gain of 0.5%. 10-year right now 4.15%, with the 2-year 3.85%. Gold down $14 the ounce. Spot gold right now down 0.5%. 31.09, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.3%. WTI 71.21 a barrel. Those tariffs will be kicking in right away. We got word from the White House moments ago with the White House spokesperson saying tariffs will go into effect right after the announcement. That announcement scheduled for the Rose Garden tomorrow, 4 p.m. Yes, going to have it for you live on Bloomberg Radio and television. A key gauge of U.S. manufacturing is signaling a downturn. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
The ISM Factory Index signaled contraction in March after starting the year on a pretty good footing. Blame U.S. tariffs. Prices accelerated sharply, factory orders, production, and payrolls all declined. Some firms are halting investment. On the other hand, as economists often say, the S&P Global Factory Index improved a bit in late March after signaling a downturn earlier in the month. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
A move lower for airline stocks. Right now, Southwest, Delta, and American all trading lower after Jefferies downgraded their ratings amid uncertainty over consumer and corporate spending. Case in point, Southwest down 5.7%. AAL, American Airlines, down 3.4%. Delta, lower now by 3.9%. And briefly, the French hotel group Accor is warning that forward bookings from Europe to the U.S. this summer are down by 25%. Accor owns the Motel 6 chain. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues right now. Long day ahead. Here he is, Joe Mathieu.
All right, Charlie, you said it. We'll have special coverage of the next couple of evenings, by the way. If you're on your radio, your TV, your YouTube, you can count on us here on Balance of Power to keep you posted on the tariff news. 5 to 7 p.m. later this evening, 5 to 7 p.m. on Liberation Day. I suspect will be coinciding with an announcement in the Rose Garden that's apparently going to be happening at 4 p.m. Closing bell, we turn our attention to the White House to get a sense of what's going to happen at the next opening bell. But the Trump administration is making more news here when it comes to, I don't know if I can call them mass deportations. How about we just call them deportations to El Salvador? A lot of controversy over the use, as we told you, of this old Alien Enemies Act a couple of weeks back. Alleged gang members put on airplanes, flown to El Salvador. A judge tried to have the plane turned around. White House kept it going. Since then, they've not been using the Alien Enemies Act. Case in point, Sunday night, 17 alleged gang members on a plane to El Salvador. 13, by the way, MS-13 and Tren de Aragua gang members, according to the Secretary of State, who called this a counterterrorism operation. That's the grounds through which they are being removed from the country. 10 Salvadorans, 7 Venezuelans previously held at Guantanamo Bay. Those sent to El Salvador on Sunday, as I read in the Washington Post, had either been convicted of or had pending charges ranging from drug possession, theft to child sex abuse, and murder, according to officials at the White House. They're trying to be more deliberate in explaining why these people are being rounded up and sent out of the country. Because we've had some cases popping up where this may not have been the case, and in some cases worrying people here about potentially innocent people being scooped up and shipped out. According to court papers filed this weekend, one of the men accused of belonging to the Tren de Aragua gang because of his tattoos was Andre Jose Hernandez Romero, a professional makeup artist who has often worked at beauty pageants and identifies as gay. Lawyers for Mr. Hernandez Romero, as I read in the New York Times, said his tattoos included one showing a crown next to the word mom and another of a crown next to the word dad. They say these were not gang tattoos and no evidence that he's affiliated in any way. He fled Venezuela due to persecution for his political opinion, his sexual orientation, according to his lawyer, and tattoos have an obvious explanation that has nothing to do with a gang. But right now, at a pretty dangerous place in El Salvador. This case was highlighted by Joe Rogan, of all people. Of course, a major Trump supporter helped to get Donald Trump elected. And he talked about it on his program. Listen.
This is kind of crazy that could be possible. That's horrific. And that's bad for the cause. Like, the cause is, let's get the gang members out. Everybody agrees. But let's not innocent gay hairdressers get lumped up with the gangs. And then, like, how long before that guy can get out? Can we figure out how to get him out? Is there any plan in place to alert the authorities that they've made a horrible mistake and correct it?
This is not the only case that we have heard like this as we assemble our signature panel for their take on the optics, the politics behind what was thought to be a booster for Donald Trump. Promises made, right? Promises kept. But if you're losing Joe Rogan, you wonder what's happening with this program. Rick Davis is partner at Stone Court Capital, our Republican strategist. G.D. Shanzano, our Democratic analyst, senior democracy fellow with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, both Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, we've talked before, the three of us, about targeted roundups like this. And in the case that we saw before, a lack of evidence that maybe everyone belonged on that airplane. What do isolated cases tell you like this about the veracity of the program and the way the public is going to view all of this? If you lost Joe Rogan, have you lost MAGA?
I don't know if they've lost MAGA yet, but Joe Rogan is right about this. There are several cases now that have come to light. The latest in a filing last night that you mentioned, and this was somebody who was not supposed to be deported, yet he is sent to the prison, and stunningly, we have no means by which to get him back. And that's perplexing to many people. But the reality is he is now in El Salvadorian custody, and they can do what they want with him. And this goes back to what that justice, the judge who heard the case the other day, Patricia Millett, said. She said, given the fact that you have no process by which you are determining who is a gang member and who is not, you could pick any of us off the street and throw away the key. There we go. And that's why due process matters. It does matter because people's lives are at stake, both this hairdresser now and this other gentleman that they're talking about, and who knows how many other people. There were also women who have been sent back, thankfully, who were mistakenly rounded up in some of this. So there is a process that has to occur. And if the government cannot do this properly, they are not doing their job.
Rick, there's another case here the New York Times points out. Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia of Maryland, now in prison in El Salvador, was in the United States legally and deported because of, quote, an administrative error, unquote, according to Trump administration officials, saying the American courts lack the jurisdiction to get him released. How many cases like this can the administration afford?
Yeah, I mean, here was a legitimate asylum seeker, running from government persecution in El Salvador, and we wrapped him up and sent him back by mistake. I mean, even the Homeland Security has admitted that they should have never sent him there, but now there's nothing they can do about it. Maybe the courts can issue a request to the Salvadorans. So, look, I mean, we've talked about this before. I mean, these are very popular from a political perspective policies, right? Rounding up Salvadoran gangs, rounding up Venezuelan gangs, rounding up Mexican gangs, and sending them home, sending them to prison. The American public loves that. Right? Why are they here to begin with? And so you only hurt a positive outcome when you don't use, as Jeannie says, a due process that allows you to find the mistakes. Abrego Garcia was a mistake. We've even admitted that. But there was no review. There was no due process. And so you can expect those mistakes to be made. So the idea that there's nothing we can do once he's back in El Salvador kind of betrays our standing as a leader in the hemisphere. We're the ones who've cut a deal to put all these El Salvadorans back into a big prison down there. We don't have enough leeway to get back the ones that shouldn't be there. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I think all this tends to diminish what is a popular policy, but it does bring it home to the White House on competency. We've seen over and over the firing of federal workers and then the rehiring of federal workers, policies that have been, projects that have been zeroed out that have to be put back in, pretty consistent losses at the federal level and the courts over trying to expand presidential power. At what point in time do we start talking about the competency of this administration? Is it competency or is it intentional? I think that's something that could burn a hole in their popularity, especially programs like these immigration projects.
Well, that's a really interesting way you frame that here. Jeannie, we heard from a terminal subscriber. This just popped up in front of me. When you consider what Rick just asked, how you weigh what this terminal subscriber describes as 1,000+ bad dudes gone. I don't know that that's a real number. And one guy who shouldn't have been deported. How many crimes did we save from being committed versus one who should not have been deported, Jeannie?
Yeah, I mean, the fact is we don't know. We were just talking about 2 separate cases. So already there are 2 and more reported. But the reality is we simply don't know because the means by which the government is removing people denies everybody even a scintilla of due process. And that means we are all vulnerable. All they have to do, to go back to what the judge said, is to pick us up off the street, say we're a member of a gang because of our clothing or our tattoos or whatever it is, and off we go. And in this case, we are sending these people to El Salvador, to a maximum security prison. And people should look at that video, which President Bukele proudly displays over there. These are metal bars. These are people who can't use even forks or knives to eat. 50+ men to a room who are stripped down to T-shirts and shorts, their heads shaven. And okay, if people are okay with that in the context of somebody who is guilty of a crime, absolutely. But the problem here, as we can see and the government admits, we mistakenly picked people up and made this mistake. And unfortunately, we can't unwind it. And let's not forget, we've all been listening to Elon Musk go on Fox and everywhere else and say, mistakes will be made, but we'll correct them. The fact is, there are some mistakes you make which have huge harms on people's lives, and you can't correct them. Hopefully they can correct this one, but at this point, there is no getting this man out of custody where we sent him in exchange for millions of dollars.
Yeah, this place is a real hellhole. If you're with us on YouTube, we're showing you images from that maximum security prison, video from El Salvador where these migrants are being sent. I'll give you a swing at that, Rick, because I think it really gets to the core of what we're talking about here. Why is it important that every individual here is given due process? Why not worry about one lost if it means locking up 1,000 bad guys?
Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think we are a country of rules and laws, and we should be able to do both. We should be able to round up bad guys, know they're bad guys, have prosecuted those bad guys, and ship them out of here post haste. But we are also a country that should be able to track 1,000 people, know what their records are, and if they're clean, put them back in the home where they're married to a U.S. citizen. In the case of Abrego Garcia, has a disabled child who's an American citizen. I mean, like, we wouldn't have known that he had been picked up and delivered to El Salvador if not for his wife seeing him on a video. There was no communication to the household at all. That's not how we treat citizens of the United States. We are a very sophisticated country that ought to be able to do all these things and do them in a way that we can be proud of and not have to be embarrassed by, you know, something that the government has done and now claims has no power to undo.
Is it a good thing, at least, Jeannie, in a remaining moment here, that the White House is no longer using the Alien Enemies Act? It's going in the direction of a counterterrorism operation. Does that become more effective?
You know, it raises different challenges, certainly legally, but the reality is that we need to be able to give people due process. You know, we have very few liberties protected in the original body of our Constitution. One of them is habeas corpus. Governments going back to England way before we were founded. You don't pick people off the street, put them in jail, and throw away the key. You tell them what are the charges. You give them a chance to respond. That's how civilized countries behave. And we are civilized. To Rick's point, we can do far better. And it does matter when one
and Rick Davis.
People.
They'll be back with us in our second hour. We'll let you finish that thought, Jeannie, right here on Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
It's the day before, and still no clarity. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as we count down to President Trump announcing tariffs, we believe, on most imports into the U.S., so he says. But we still don't have details on this, and the market is waiting. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington, the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Kailey, Wall Street trained on the Rose Garden tomorrow, right around the time the closing bell rings, but still may not get all the info at once.
Yeah, it's going to be a question of how specific the president gets and how much details need to be filled in after the fact. Keeping in mind that today, April 1st, happy beginning of the second quarter, by the way, indeed, was the deadline for some of his most senior trade-oriented officials to submit their reports to him. Scott Bessent, Howard Lutnick, and the USTR Jamison Greer were going to provide their recommendations today ahead of the announcement tomorrow. But President Trump told reporters in the Oval Office last night that he settled on these tariffs a long time ago. So maybe everything is already decided. We just haven't been read in yet.
With Kid Rock at his side. He suggested, though, that these tariffs would be substantially, in some cases, lower than had been expected, that we would be kind in relative terms to our trading partners. Kailey, so maybe not the across-the-board knock in the head that some people are expecting.
Yeah, the description of it being kind and fair from the president is an interesting one. We should also keep in mind that we just had a press briefing wrapping up from the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, who, when asked when these tariffs will take effect, said it's immediately after the announcement.
That'll be April 2nd, as the president has been promising. We'll get an update for you. Jenny Welch is going to come in from our Bloomberg economics team as we start considering the impact of this announcement.
Yeah, and the impact on financial markets, of course, is included in that. And Charlie Pellet is keeping tabs on this debut of trading for the second quarter for us from New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey and Joe. Indeed, as you point out, we don't know what, but we do know when. 4 p.m. Wall Street time. Complete coverage on Bloomberg television and radio. President Trump's sweeping tariffs will take immediate effect when they are announced. Again, it comes down to 4 p.m. at an event at the White House Rose Garden. Right now, we have got stocks swinging between gains and losses, at least for the Dow right now, with the S&P up 17. That is a gain of 0.3%. The Dow up 18, up just under 0.1%. NASDAQ up 135, a tech rebound up by 0.8%. 10-year 4.16% with a 2-year 3.86%. Spot gold down 0.5%, 31.07 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.4%, 71.19 for a barrel of WTI. Wedbush Securities analyst Dan Ives says there are no winners when it comes to President Trump's tariffs on car imports. In a note, he describes the levies as a backbreaker and Armageddon for the automotive industry. He says tariffs on those vehicles will add $100 billion in costs annually to the auto industry, which will be passed directly on to consumers and erode demand. Now, ahead of potential tariffs, we have got GM up by 0.8%, Ford down 1.1%, Stellantis down 1.5%, Tesla, all part of a broader tech rally, Tesla surging today by 6%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. And Balance of Power continues right now. Lots going on. Long day ahead. Back we go to Washington and your hosts Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Oh, long days ahead, Charlie Pellet. Days plural, as we're waiting for the announcement tomorrow of these reciprocal tariffs that President Trump has long been promising. And when he has said reciprocal, he has repeatedly said that that means whatever other countries charge the United States in terms of levies on imports, the U.S. will charge them. Except the president also said last night that in some instances, what we charge them actually may be less than they charge us. This is what he said.
They're reciprocal. So whatever they charge us, we charge them, but we're being nicer than they were. The numbers will be lower than what they've been charging us, and in some cases maybe substantially lower, but we sort of have a world obligation perhaps. But we're going to be very nice. Relatively speaking, we're going to be very kind. I think they have a chance of doing better, actually, with the tariffs. It can actually help them in a certain way. And I think a lot of them will drop their tariffs.
That's where we begin our conversation with Jenny Welch, Chief Geoeconomics Analyst at Bloomberg Economics, and the perfect voice for what we're about to hear from the White House. Jenny, it all happens apparently at 4 o'clock tomorrow. Markets will just be closing. How kind do we think the president is going to be? And what do you make of these different stories? It depends on the hour, not the day, as to what we're hearing from the president.
I mean, part of this is policy process that generally speaking, you present options to the president for him to choose from. And there's debates and deliberations with senior staff. In his case, it might not just be the people in government posts, but other stakeholders that he's talking to. And then he'll make a decision. And I think for President Trump in particular, that can be somewhat of an iterative process where it can, change as he's talking to different people and getting new information. I think also what it suggests is today those reports were due from Commerce and USTR and other government agencies advising on what the tariff rate should be. They might still be making a decision, in particular if they're thinking about tailoring tariffs to individual countries. There's a lot of questions about exactly how you would quantify non-tariff barriers, what level you would set those tariffs at, if you're factoring in conversations he's having with those countries to negotiate in advance. A lot of potential factors at play. Maybe a decision is still underway.
Well, he has 27 hours, I guess, to finalize whatever decision ultimately he wants to make before he actually addresses this subject with the American people. But the suggestion that whatever tariffs he does decide on will be less than what is charged on U.S. imports, who would that be best news for, Jenny, in terms of people or countries that do have high rates on U.S. imports right now that may breathe somewhat of a sigh of relief at that notion?
So part of it depends on how you're defining what they charge us, right? Is he talking about the tariff barriers in particular, in which case that's a good news for Southeast Asia, for other developing countries where those tariff gaps tend to be pretty significant. India is another example there. If he's talking about non-tariff barriers, that's a very different set of countries. That's largely the EU, for example, the VAT. Now, I think based on his other comments about the EU, he's unlikely to give them a little bit of a pass. But there are other countries that he's been talking to quite extensively. India and the UK are prime examples there, where maybe he's thinking about it from that perspective. He might also be thinking about it in terms of what they're doing outside the trade realm. So Mexico is a good example there. What have they been doing on fentanyl? What have they been doing on immigration? And then a third consideration might be, how is the stock market reacting to some of these theories that are out there, and how would reciprocal tariffs on some of our closest trade partners impact the U.S. economy?
Take us behind the scenes for a minute, realizing that Donald Trump could be operating on gut to some extent tomorrow. You talked about the reports that are due today. You worked for the Biden White House as an advisor. Is there some big room in the OEOB next door where people are out with maps and binders and they're up all night figuring this out right now? What happens in the 24 hours ahead of an announcement like this?
Yes, I think up until now, USTR Commerce and other staff have probably been working around the clock to complete these reports. I mean, I think Secretary Lutnick put it right. This is like trying to negotiate trade deals with all your major trade partners in the span of a couple of weeks. That's incredibly difficult work to be doing. I think now a lot of it is going to be the deliberations at the senior level, based on those reports, based on those policy recommendations about what they actually implement, and figuring out the rollout plan. I mean, just before coming in here, the White House announced these tariffs are going to go into effect immediately after the announcement tomorrow.
Well, and what's not immediate are still things that he's promised he might look at tariffing. Semiconductors, pharmaceutical imports. You could add lumber to this equation as well. He's talked about this notion of secondary tariffs, Jenny, beyond what he's calling Liberation Day. Just how much more liberation in his mind is he planning to bring here?
Well, and the other thing to flag that, is kind of constantly the elephant in the room is China. The other major report that was delivered today was USTR's review of the Phase 1 trade deal, which probably was not very favorable for Beijing. So between that and reciprocal tariffs, we could also see an escalation of that trade war further. So yes, a number of additional tariff waves to come. Wow.
So it's not going to be over in the Rose Garden
like
tomorrow, is the moral of the story. Jenny Welch, Chief Geoeconomics Analyst at Bloomberg Economics. Thank you so much. And of course, when we consider these many different layers of tariffs we ultimately could end up with, we come back to the same question, Joe, which is what will the impact be not just on inflation, on prices, but also on growth if those higher prices make consumers balk and suddenly mean demand goes down?
Well, and that's a pretty big question when the entire sort of Trump economic approach is based on growth by way of tax cuts that, incidentally, they're going to start working on for real this week in the Senate. And it's hard to have both. Yeah,
and it certainly puts policymakers in a hard position, not just fiscal policymakers who are assessing the tax picture, but monetary policymakers as well, who have to figure out what exactly is likely to happen to the U.S. economy as a result of these tariff decisions. We actually heard from the Richmond Fed President Tom Barkin about the impact we could see it having earlier today. This is what he said.
Obviously, some amount of that will pass through into prices, and so that will be inflationary, and maybe it'll be short-term, maybe long-term, we'll see. But I'm just as interested in what's going to happen on the employment side, because if you're a company that raises prices, the demand curve would suggest your volume's going to go down. And if you're a company that can't raise prices, then your margin goes down. In either case, you're going to start working on operational efficiencies, and that means headcount.
So we want to get more on this now and turn to Liz Pancotti. She's Managing Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Groundwork Collaborative, and she's here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So, Liz, great to have you. Welcome back to Balance of Power. We just heard Barkin there talking about really the risks to both sides of the Fed's dual mandate, that this is not just an inflation concern, but a labor market and growth-oriented concern as well. Given the limited information with which we're working right now, and hopefully we'll have more in hand tomorrow, which one of those risks do you think is greater?
I think they are both equally great, and we heard the Fed last week say everything but the S word, right? Everything but stagflation. They said they are expecting higher unemployment, slower growth, faster inflation. When you put those three things together in a mixing bowl, they usually bake up into the same thing. And so I think the Fed is taking very seriously the balance of all of these risks. But given the tool that the president is using to prod all of those things, the Fed's toolbox is limited to respond to it, and simply moving around the Fed funds rate isn't quite, the right screwdriver or whatever to deal with the ramifications of that.
Well, how much of a picture do you think the president's going to paint tomorrow, as opposed to a partial image of what's to come? Because there was great hope for a clarifying moment. I'm not sure we can find anyone who expects that.
I just heard, reporting from the White House that the press secretary said that he is crafting the perfect tariff policy and that everything will be clear tomorrow and that they expect certainty for markets tomorrow. It's one thing to move your announcement back to when markets close at 4 p.m. It gives you a little bit of a buffer of what markets can respond to. And so he has said that those tariffs will go into place immediately, no 24-hour, 48-hour, month-long lead time. Yeah. And so even for, the folks who have to enforce these tariffs at our ports and borders, they have to have certainty to be able to levy those tariffs. So hopefully something will be written down, but I'm not confident given that the president has, moved from just reciprocal to 20% blanket to different policies for different countries. It's very difficult to do that in, 24-hour period.
Well, and so if this is immediate, what will the impact be on businesses who have tried to, I guess, in advance import what they can, make investment decisions according to what their best anticipation of could be happening? If this is immediate, how immediate will the impact be on their actual supply chains if they haven't had a chance to fully reorient them or to stockpile enough to last them for a while?
We have seen for a couple of months that companies were expecting something on the tariff front, and so they have been stockpiling a bit. You saw that in the ISM report this morning. You saw it in durable goods a week ago. We have started to see companies, and even in their annual earnings calls, which have been going on the last few weeks, they have said we are putting orders in, trying to get ahead of these things. As you know, a month ago, he put in place the Mexico-Canada tariffs and then rolled back or paused many of those for a month. So for these companies, it's very difficult to have any sense of certainty. For most supply chains, the orders they are placing right now will likely not hit shelves for 6 to 12 months. And so I think the real question here is, when do companies start hiking prices for consumers? Is it immediate, even though those goods are not the ones being tariffed? Do they try to pad that a little bit to see if things come down? What certainty can consumers expect, I think, is a big question. But on both ends, you are seeing in, both in small business uncertainty and consumer confidence and sentiment, everyone is uncertain right now. Wall Street, consumers, workers, small businesses.
It's really interesting to see consumers take part in that. It's one thing for corporations to be front-loading these tariffs here, but the word we got today from General Motors, deliveries up 17% in the first quarter, 15% gain in retail volume. Ford saw retail sales rise. Toyota up from the same time over last year. People are aware of this in a way that they might not be other economic trends or stories where they want to get something done before tomorrow. How far could this go from here?
We've seen polling that about 80% of people are aware the president is doing something on tariffs, and almost all of those people are aware that it will cause prices to increase. The approval of those tariffs is very mixed. It's almost a 50-50 split as to whether people like them or not, even knowing that their prices will increase. But I think after 4 years of consumer uncertainty, what Heather Long from the Washington Post dubbed it whack-a-mole inflation of something is always popping. Consumers have become a lot more price sensitive in the last 4 years, just given various bouts of inflation, and especially now with sticky high prices. And so I think they pay attention to a lot of this stuff. The president is also out there every single day saying he will do something, not saying what he will do, but saying he will do something. Tariffs have been the news du jour for almost the administration.
That would suggest, though, that we're going to have a big downturn after all of this front-loading in the first quarter. What's the second half of the year going to look like on a car dealer lot?
I mean, you've already seen that ISM is saying that this is the first contraction in a number of months, 2026, I think. It is not good. I think for those car dealerships, even if these things have carve-outs for North American autos or for some countries, it's not quite clear how you can even move forward, because in a month, the president might do something different. I think both for consumers and businesses, it's just a difficult kind of environment to operate in and to make large decisions like buying a car, buying a house, going on vacation, even what I'm going to spend at the grocery store this week, because my utility bill could hike next week if heating oil prices go up.
Well, and I feel like I've asked this question a number of times as we've kind of been building up to tomorrow, but this notion that prices can only increase so long as consumers tolerate them, right? Companies have an ability to pass on costs until they don't. And I just wonder if they can't exercise that same kind of pricing power this time, given the kind of bad vibes we are seeing out there in the consumption economy. What does that imply for where we might see businesses actually just then trying to cut costs elsewhere in terms of hiring or even layoffs? What could this actually portend?
That not necessarily as far as going to layoffs or hiring, but in the first Trump administration, not all of the tariffs were passed through as price increases. Companies said, we think we can cut a little cost here, find some pennies in the couch cushions here, lower our margins by a couple basis points here, and together, taking all of that, you didn't see a one-to-one pass through.
We're talking a different scale this time, though.
More recently, both a different scale and more recently during the pandemic, during Russia, Ukraine, et cetera, companies, in fact, in many cases, passed more than their increased costs on to consumers. Consumers are extremely price sensitive. We've seen expectations for jobs day on Friday that wage growth will tick down. JOLTS was a miss this morning. We are already starting to see softening in the labor market. And so if you, again, as the Fed has said, higher unemployment, higher prices, and slower growth, all taken together results in what you had in the 70s, which was the last time uncertainty was this bad.
If we get across the board tariffs tomorrow, and to your point, we don't know. We could get some form of reciprocal. We could get a lot of different forms of things. He says he'll be relatively kind. But say you get that 20% across the board that at one time was promised by this president. Is that an automatic recession, as some have predicted?
I don't know that I want to put odds on it, but I did see that, Mark Zandi doubled his recession forecast this week. And that is, I think for a while, I sat in this room a couple months ago after the election and said the market has priced a lot of this in. We had not seen a lot of market movement kind of in the month after the election. We are almost 100 days into this administration. Market's up a little bit today, but I suspect we won't see that for very long. Stock market, obviously not the entire story, but I think as we start to see more and more data come in on slower job growth, potentially negative jobs, slowing wage growth, higher prices, all of that taken together points to recession.
We always look forward to having you with us, Liz. Thank you so much. Liz Pancotti, Groundwork Collaborative, with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington as we drive forward with our signature panel next. We'll have Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano weigh in on this with Liberation Day, as Donald Trump would say, tomorrow, and the jobs report Friday. This is Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Another volatile session for the U.S. stock market. The Dow back in the red, now lower by 82 points. A drop there of 0.2%. S&P 500 indexes advancing up 7 now, up by about 0.1%. The S&P did wipe out a 1% slide triggered by weak manufacturing and jobs data. And we are seeing a surge in the so-called Mag 7 stocks. Right now, NASDAQ is up 98, up by about 0.6%. The NASDAQ 100 index up 0.4. Again, the Dow lower by 0.2%. 10-year yield at 4.15% with a 2-year 3.85%. Spot gold retreating from a record, down 0.4%. $31.12 the ounce on gold. West Texas Intermediate crude down 0.3%. A barrel of WTI now at 71.27, and Bitcoin is surging 3.1%, 84,944. The conservative media outlet Newsmax is having a meme stock moment with shares surging again today. Right now we have got shares of Newsmax. They are rallying now by 123.6%. That is building on the 735% surge in its debut session. And President Trump has signed an executive order aimed at cracking down on ticket scalping and fees that drive up the cost of attending live events for consumers. Live Nation is the world's largest ticket seller. It is also the parent of Ticketmaster. Live Nation shares today up by 0.8%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. And back we go to Washington. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Charlie Pellet in New York with a look at how we're trading ahead of the big event in Washington tomorrow. The planned announcement in the Rose Garden at 4 p.m. Eastern time, after the market closed, notably, of President Trump's reciprocal tariffs that we've long been awaiting. And while that is sure to dominate a lot of the news cycle tomorrow, as it is today, we also have to note that tomorrow we'll have some results in hand from a few races that could be bellwethers in terms of sentiment voters are feeling right now about President Trump and the Republican Party overall. There are two special House elections in Florida today, one in Matt Gaetz's district. He, of course, vacated his seat. The other in the old district of now National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, where the Republican candidate in what is a plus 30 Republican district, at least back in November, is in a pretty tight race with his Democratic challenger. And then there's also Wisconsin to consider, as there's a Supreme Court election that has drawn in tens of millions of dollars, Joe. Some of that money, actually a lot of it, coming from Elon Musk.
Yeah, we talk a lot about Liberation Day, but these are the big stories happening in politics today. These elections are happening right now, and we want to get the sense of our political panel on both of these. Rick Davis is with us, Bloomberg Politics contributor, partner at Stone Court Capital, our Republican strategist, and Democratic analyst Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University. Great to have you both here. I'm going to start with the Wisconsin Supreme Court battle. As the Washington Post today describes it as the most expensive judicial battle in U.S. history. We've talked about this a bit. $90 million surrounding this race. Rick Davis, what makes this so expensive?
You know, it's kind of a referendum. It's a referendum on control of the Supreme Court in Wisconsin. So if Susan Crawford wins, it stays in liberal hands. If Brad Sherman wins, it becomes a better chance of becoming conservative. So there's an ideological battle in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a key presidential primary state and a presidential electoral state. So it has great implications for the next presidential campaign. And on top of all that, Elon Musk has done his best to nationalize the race and make it a referendum on Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And I make that order specifically because it's more about Elon Musk right now than Donald Trump. Donald Trump hasn't raised a finger in this state. It's really quite amazing that $90 million goes into this operation for both Republicans and Democrats, and Donald Trump's on the sidelines. But his man, Elon Musk, isn't jumping up and down with a piece of cheese on his head and spending money like it was going out of style. But it all boils down to turnout. Today's election day. Turnout's all that matters. And I would say advantage Democrats. Republicans have a much worse turnout model in Wisconsin. Their voters don't show up for these kinds of special elections. They're Trump voters, so they'll come en masse on a presidential day, but not much for midterms and special elections. So wait and see. But I would say I'd rather have the turnout of the Democratic voters than the Republicans going into an election like this.
Well, and if the Democrats do turn out and the liberal majority on the state Supreme Court, Jeannie, is retained, to Rick's point, is it Elon Musk who ultimately ends up being the fall guy for that?
You know, I think he could. By the way, happy Election Day, Kailey. I know we're all talking about Liberation Day, but I love a good Election Day. First voting since Donald Trump got into office again. You know, I do think that he could take the heat, but I also think this is importantly tied to what we're going to see tomorrow, because imagine if the Republican loses in Wisconsin. I think they'll win, obviously, in Florida, but if they lose in Wisconsin, it's a state seat, sure, and it's on the Supreme Court. But imagine for those majority makers on the Republican side in the House. The big threat has been that if you don't go with Donald Trump, he is going to have a funded primary challenge against you. And that primary challenge funding is arguably going to come from Elon Musk. But if he's putting $20 million into a Supreme Court race in Wisconsin and he can't win that, then that may give some of those Republicans in the House a moment to say, I may go against the president and Elon Musk on something that my constituents are not in favor of. So I really think for Republicans, these elections today matter an awful lot as it pertains to Donald Trump's economic agenda. If all he can do is tariff us to death, he's got to get the other parts of its economic agenda through Congress. Deregulation, energy production, and tax cuts. Otherwise, he's going to have a very unhappy base of Republicans.
Do you agree with Jeannie on that, Rick? Is it fair to call these two specials in Florida, specifically the 6th and of course, the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, proxies or tests somehow of the Trump agenda?
You know, it's tricky. I would say, again, another good example, Donald Trump really hasn't weighed in. The Republican Party hasn't spent a lot of time and money on him. Most of the activities come from outside groups. And these are Trump plus 30, as Kailey said, districts. I mean, overwhelmingly supportive of Donald Trump. And even the most dire Republicans I've talked to said, well, a win by 10% is going to be enough to be respectable. No one's going to play the over-under, right? I mean, a win is a win, and I don't think it'll reflect significantly on the administration. Frankly, a Democratic winning in Lehigh Valley, Pennsylvania, like they did a couple weeks ago, that sends shockwaves through Republicans because Lehigh Valley is really one of the most important counties in Pennsylvania. As Lehigh goes, so does the state. And I guarantee you there are people like David McCormick and others who are sitting there going, wow, I really don't care what's happening in Florida. We're going to have 2 Republicans come out of there. But the fact that we're losing in Lehigh Valley, that is a big deal. So I think there's a lot of questions, as Jeannie said, a lot of Republicans scratching their head right now going, wow, I mean, like, am I at risk if I do support Donald Trump's agenda? And I would say one thing, just to be clear, tariffs are not popular. Cato Institute has a poll shows 75% of the people disagree with the approach on tariffs. That is not something that's going to get you reelected, even in a primary right now. So there are a lot of people walking the plank right now for this Trump agenda, and everyone's hoping right now it pans out.
Well, so when we consider the timing here, Jeannie, we know that the president has suggested the reason he's announcing reciprocal tariffs on April 2nd instead of April 1st was because he didn't want it to coincide with April Fool's Day. But is it also possible he didn't want it to coincide with these special elections?
I think that's absolutely right. It never rang true that Donald Trump was that concerned about April Fool's Day. And listen, this is going to have an impact. I don't think anybody expects Democrats to win in 6 and 1 in Florida. Those are, to Rick's point, to your point, 30, 40-point districts for Donald Trump. But you're going to make a lot of members of the GOP very nervous if this is a close victory, because don't forget, you have some Republicans sitting in districts Kamala Harris won, some Republicans sitting in much narrower districts. And so those are the people who are going to be concerned. And again, to Rick's point, the tariffs are not popular. What is popular? Deregulation, the tax cuts, all of that takes moving through Congress. And with a majority this tight, the loss of any one of these members who begins to feel the threat is not necessarily Elon Musk's money, but going with Donald Trump's agenda, that could be the death knell for Donald Trump's ability to push through his entire economic agenda. So the White House is watching this very, very carefully today.
Hey, Rick, if everyone's so confident that the Republicans will win the 2 specials in Florida, and we see Randy Fine expected to win by 10 or 15, depending on who you ask, albeit that's not the best performance for a district that Donald Trump won by over 30 points. But why did they have to sideline Elise Stefanik? That was said to be in part driven by concerns about Florida. When it comes down to hard math, though, these 2 stay Republican. Why did her career have to change, or was it about more than Florida?
Yeah, I think it's more than Florida. I mean, Florida, 2-3 weeks ago, based on what Trump pollster Tony Fabrizio was saying, was not a sure thing. And look, it's election day, right? Nothing's sure on election day. But I would say, too, probably more to do with trying to get this agenda through Congress. They have the slimmest of margins, 2 votes. If they take any risk at any time, with one of those votes, they may not be able to get an agenda that Donald Trump has campaigned on for 4 years through this Congress. And of course, we know that the Trump folks want to push all this through in year 1 because they know next year is an election year for Congress and it's anything goes. People are going to start voting the way they need to get reelected. And so you can't count on Republicans doing what Trump wants them to do. So I think it was a smart move from the perspective of just ensuring that this congressional agenda that he's got gets the action that it needs to get.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, our signature political panel, joining us on this election day, one day ahead. of Reciprocal Tariffs Day. Thank you so much. And while we're watching those stories domestically, I do want to note we just got some headlines crossing the terminal related to geopolitics. These coming after a presser between the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the German Foreign Affairs Minister Annalena Baerbock regarding the ongoing war with Russia. President Zelensky said that Ukraine will be picking attorneys, lawyers, for talks with the U.S. in coming days, noting that NATO has not been discussed in talks around an economic deal with the United States. He also, Joe, says that Russia has halted long-range drone strikes as of today, Tuesday, and says that this coming Friday he will be discussing peace troops with allies.
That's all of it from President Zelensky, indeed. And this, of course, follows the rhetoric we heard from Donald Trump over the weekend that he was angry. He used some other language to describe how he felt about Vladimir Putin, and maybe that's unlocking a little bit of movement here. If Russia is, in fact, halting drone strikes, it's a pretty major development in lieu of a ceasefire.
Yeah, I just wonder what the would-be targets of those drones were. If this is pertaining to energy infrastructure in the Black Sea, things that both sides have been working on a temporary ceasefire on. We'll, of course, keep you up to date on this story. And we still have much more ahead here on Balance of Power. Robert McWhirter is going to join us on the fight between the Trump administration and the courts. That's still ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We've got the Dow lower, the S&P, NASDAQ. They are both higher. Stocks almost wiped out gains after the White House said President Trump's sweeping tariffs will take immediate effect after they are announced tomorrow, adding to concerns about the economic impacts of a trade war. All of this expected at 4 p.m. Wall Street time in the Oval Garden. We'll have it live for you on Bloomberg. Again, the S&P now higher by 8, up 0.1%. The Dow swinging between gains and losses, down 90 now, down 0.2. We've got NASDAQ up 0.7%. The NASDAQ 100 index higher by 0.5%. 10-year at 4.15%. The 2-year 3.85%. Spot gold down $10 the ounce, $31.12. That is a drop of 0.4%. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.3%, now $71.30 a barrel. And Bitcoin now higher by 3.4%, 85,206 on Bitcoin. Shake Shack shares are higher after Loop Capital Markets upgraded the burger chain stock to buy from hold, citing a recent pullback in shares as well as potential upside to the company's earnings. Shake Shack shares, they're now higher by 2.7%. Hooters of America, the casual dining chain known for its chicken wings and server attire, has become the latest iconic restaurant brand to falter in the face of stubborn inflation and Americans' fading interest in eating out. The Chapter 11 filing follows that of seafood chain Red Lobster and TGI Fridays. Again, recapping, S&P 500 index higher by 11, gain there of 0.2%. Back we go to Washington. Balance of Power continues right now. Once again, your hosts, Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Thank you, Charlie Pellet, watching Wall Street for us every day here on the fastest show in politics. We're live in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz. I am Joe Mathieu. Ahead of Liberation Day tomorrow, we're dealing with a couple of other stories that are impacting two special congressional elections underway in Florida, a Wisconsin Supreme Court election, and an important hearing today happening on Capitol Hill. Brings us back to the Trump narrative from a different side here. We've talked a lot about President Trump's calls to impeach judges. Kailey, we've heard as well about legislation on Capitol Hill now that might seek to codify this effort, not to impeach judges, but to limit their scope and authority.
Specifically, whether or not they can issue nationwide injunctions. This is what the act that was put forward and actually forced through a committee by Congressman Darrell Issa would do. It's the so-called rogue judges in their mind, which was actually mentioned today in the Judiciary Subcommittee where Jim Jordan, the chair of the committee, was presiding over. He said that kind of three avenues to address judges like Judge Boasberg, who, of course, is at the center of the Venezuela alleged gang members deportation case. You either pass this bill, appeal to the Supreme Court, you have oversight, or use the power of the purse, the appropriations process to keep the judicial branch or judges in check.
So it's a Judiciary Committee hearing underway. The legislation by Congressman Darrell Issa that Kailey mentions is now being taken up by the House, and the Speaker got into this earlier today. Mike Johnson, listen.
We have broad scope. We have all authority over the lower courts, okay? We're not defunding courts, and we're not doing anything other than limiting in this legislation the ability of a judge to issue a nationwide injunction, because that is the problem that has gotten totally out of control. And we need this check on the judiciary, and I think we're going to prove that on the floor. One activist judge should not issue a nationwide injunction against the president's policies, and these district courts have to stay within their constitutional bounds.
So we want to get more on this and turn to Robert McWhirter. He is a constitutional lawyer and practicing criminal defense and civil rights lawyer in Maricopa County, Arizona, also founder of the law office of Robert McWhirter. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to have you, Robert. When we consider this whole notion of nationwide injunctions, obviously it is not a new thing for judges to be able to impose, though, even if the subject matter pertaining to the Trump administration is hotter than it may be in other instances. What would be lost if judges' ability to do that was taken away?
Well, good morning. Look, first of all, the people who are part of this Trump coalition had no problem at all running to district courts and getting nationwide injunctions against the Biden administration immigration policies. And you can specifically refer to Greg Abbott in Texas, who ran to one district court down in the Southern District of Texas, which was very open to these things, and they issued nationwide injunctions all the time. This is how this goes. This is not judges out of power or exercising too much power. There's a simple mechanism when there's an injunction. You ask for an emergency hearing before the Circuit Court of Appeals and ultimately possibly the U.S. Supreme Court, and you can overturn that injunction if you can ask those judges and impress upon those judges that you should have that injunction overturned. It's just the way the system works. They just don't happen to like it because Donald Trump is getting a lot of these injunctions issued because his positions are constitutionally very bad. So, that's just the law. And now they're complaining about the referee. They're getting the call against him, and they're spending all the time complaining about the referee. That's all that's going on here.
Well, is the referee's life about to change here, Robert? Because it's pretty clear that impeaching judges will not be the answer. And it's interesting, Darrell Issa in this hearing had Newt Gingrich, in fact, testifying, the former speaker. They call these resolutions to impeach judges political symbols, not legislative symbols. This is legislation and could be important for judges going forward. If it passes, what will be the impact?
Yeah. First of all, on the question of an impeachment, our country does not impeach judges because we don't like their rulings. That precedent was established during the impeachment trial of Samuel Chase in 1805. And even his political opponents, including Aaron Burr, voted not to convict him on articles of impeachment in the United States Senate because they believed in the principle that you do not attack judges for their rulings. You can impeach a judge if he's, for instance, taking bribes or something like that, but not for their rulings. Now, on the question of limiting a court's jurisdiction, the Constitution at the start of Article 3 says that the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in the Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish, which means that the Congress could presumably get rid of district courts and circuit courts of appeal because they have that power. Limiting the jurisdiction is also a possibility, but that's a double-edged sword because next time when they want an injunction against a Democratic president, that power will now be gone because they've gotten rid of it. So, those injunctions serve a useful purpose. What it says is, hey, put everything on hold until we have a chance to hear the merits of your case, because if we don't put it on hold, then somebody's position or somebody's interest will be destroyed by the passage of too much time and the continuing unconstitutional actions. So, I suppose the Congress could do that. They could limit the courts, but if you limit the courts, where are you going to prosecute all these people you're saying are illegal aliens, et cetera, if you don't have those courts to do it?
Well, so when we consider the courts and the people who make arguments in them, Robert, what do you consider the greater threat here in terms of the kind of narratives we are seeing? Is it around the actual judges who interpret the law and hand down decisions, or around what we're seeing when it comes to some of the highest powered law firms that are being targeted by the administration, firms that would be bringing these cases to these judges in the first place?
Well, I think it's both. I think it's what they're doing is they're trying to make a chilling effect on good district judges who are just doing their job. They're saying, we're going to make your life difficult for just doing your job. And that's not the way the Constitution is supposed to work. Regarding attacking these law firms, this is absolutely really just beyond what should be going on. This is really absurd. And all the law firms are doing, they're taking a position, that's fair enough, but they're presenting it in court. What you're basically doing by attacking these law firms is saying, we don't want you to have a lawyer so that you can have your day in court. We just want to go forward with dictatorial powers and take away all of your resources and pro bono work or even the lawyers you hire, because we're going to attack your lawyers if your lawyers dare to take a stand against our administration and our regime. That's what's going on, and that's just really scary about what this Trump administration wants to do. Once you start attacking people's lawyers, that should tell you that your legal position is bad, and you might want to think about a new legal position.
Robert McWhirter, I want to ask you about a couple of the cases that have been identified following the deportations of alleged gang members that brought us, at least in one case here, to a call for a judge to be impeached, remembering that these alleged Venezuelan gang members were put on an airplane under the Alien Enemies Act and sent out of the country. That judge that Kailey mentioned called for the plane to be turned around. The White House did not acknowledge that, and it went on to El Salvador. A lot of other flights have gone to El Salvador, including one on Sunday night. The administration not using the Alien Enemies Act, in fact, calling it a counterterrorism operation. Robert, 17 alleged gang members to El Salvador. They were from both El Salvador and Venezuela. And there were a couple of cases that have been called out since then. In one case, a man from Maryland who was deported, according to the administration, because of an administrative error in the U.S. legally. His name, Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, you might hear about him. Another professional makeup artist by the name of Andre Jose Hernandez Romero, whose lawyer says that the tattoos that were identified to be gang tattoos, in fact, were tributes to his family. He identifies as gay. Both are said to possibly be in this maximum security prison in El Salvador for no reason. Robert, what happens to them?
Well, they could be in great danger. They may have had political asylum or whatever reason. At the very least, the American taxpayers are going to be on the hook for a huge civil judgment. Once they're determined to actually have legal status or even be citizens, the American taxpayer is going to have to pay these judgments out, because this is just a total bungle on the part of the administration. And, you know, let's not forget, they don't say who these folks are. They allege they're Venezuelan gang members. They allege they're part of Tren de Agua, but they don't know. And as I've said before, you know, what's to stop this Trump regime from going in and grabbing me or you and saying to the public, we're part of Tren de Agua, and sending us down to El Salvador? I at least speak Spanish, but hey, that could be terrible. And what's the mechanism, due process rights, that we should have as American citizens or even as undocumented persons have to actually push back on that and say, hey, I'm not even a member of the gang, much less anything else, or should be actually deported? This is a way of handling immigration law. And by the way, now they're talking about not the Alien Enemies Act, because that's a weak ground. If you truly are a member of a gang and have a criminal past, you can be deported under the immigration statutes anyway. You put them in deportation proceedings, there's a process, and you can deport people normally. This is all for show, and a lot of people are going to be hurt and maybe killed, and the American taxpayers ultimately are going to pay out millions of dollars in judgments because of the incompetence of this administration.
Well, Robert, you alluded to there the use of the Alien Enemies Act. There's also a question around the use of the Emergency Economic Powers Act when it comes to tariffs, which was supposed to be a live issue in the Senate today. As there was going to be a vote on Democratic Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia's resolution to end that emergency declaration when it comes to Canada. Due to the filibustering of Senator Cory Booker, it looks like that may be put off until tomorrow. But that aside, the fundamental question here, Robert, is whether or not this actually is authorized use of this authority for the president, these emergency economic powers, or if it is acting in defiance of the Article 1 constitutional responsibility of Congress to be the one deciding tariff policy.
Oh, I think that's absolutely the situation. It is acting in defiance. The question is whether Congress, and specifically the Republican majority, will get a backbone and start asserting their own authority and prerogatives under Article 1 of the Constitution. The Constitution was designed to have a balance of powers between the branches of government. And What has happened is parties sometimes circumvent that, but this has very much occurred here. And the Congress, under Article 1, are not exercising not only their power, their responsibility to be a check on the president. This idea of using this terrorism narrative, look, there are members of Tren de Agua that need to be deported from this country. Nobody argues that. Nobody argues about the deportation of violent criminals from this country. That's not the issue. Once you start using a terrorism designation, doesn't that kind of weaken actually fighting terrorists? I mean, let's not forget, 9/11 was a real failure of our kind of screening system in immigration law. And that's what these statutes were focused on doing. And then branching this out as a justification for tariffs to create a tariff war and expanding what you believe are your presidential powers is just not what the Constitution allows. And Congress needs to assert its own prerogatives and authority under the Constitution.
Robert, great to have you back. Robert McWhirter with us on Bloomberg TV and radio as we consider the legal side of the Trump administration right now. We'll have a lot more on this as we track the hearing, Kailey, and wait for a ruling if this goes to the Supreme Court. Yeah. We're also counting the hours, by which Senator Cory Booker has been speaking on the Senate floor. Did we cross the 18-hour mark here?
Yeah, we're almost at 2 p.m.
Wow.
We'll cross that threshold.
Senator from New Jersey in protest of many of the Trump policies we're talking about.
Yep, he's been holding up the floor of the upper chamber since 7 p.m. last night. It's quite a marathon, depending on how much longer this goes, even as he's trading out with some of his colleagues to catch a breather. This could ultimately set a record. We'll see if he's still going by the extended late edition of Balance of Power, which will be from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time tonight. We'll see you then, right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.